Roger Williams University is hosting a crisis management seminar on May 3rd at their Providence campus. Crises, whether a natural disaster, cyber attack, or financial instability, can have severe repercussions if not handled properly. This is where crisis management plays a pivotal role. Join Roger Williams MBA students and expert speakers to learn how to prepare for the unexpected. The program is totally free and open to the public. You can register online at rwu.edu/events/crisis-management-symposium.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Do you know what's in your cannabis? Recreational use legalization is on the horizon, and consumer health is PureVita Lab's priority. If you use cannabis, choose lab-tested legal cannabis products over unlabeled black market products, which are likely to contain harmful contaminants. Legal products offer a safe and controlled cannabis experience. Competent testing labs are the gatekeepers to the legal cannabis industry. PureVita Labs, founded by physicians and PhD chemists, is rooted in science and built on integrity. They are committed to helping cultivators and product manufacturers deliver clean and accurately labeled cannabis products to consumers. Know what's in your cannabis, know your dose, control your experience, and visit purevitalabs.com. That's PureVitalabs.com. All right, so welcome back into Inside Cannabis here on the Bartholomew Town Podcast. We are once again, as always, joined by the fine gentleman from PureVita Labs today. And, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, let's do some introductions. Why not?
Sure. I'm Dr. Jason Iannuccilli.
Well, that's a great introduction.
Yeah.
I'm Dr. Jonathan Martin, and together we're two of the three founders of PureVita Labs. Missing today is Dr. Stuart Proctor. He's probably back at the lab already processing samples.
Absolutely.
Well, we've had some great conversations already throughout the course of the year that have been really educational, and we've gotten great feedback on it. And we're going to start now in a more loose conversation format where really just answering questions that I've heard from you that are pretty common in this space and that are indicative of the curiosity and, even medical perspective that people are seeking when it comes to cannabis. And obviously we're approaching recreational coming very soon here in Rhode Island. Our neighboring states have it. There's obviously a now well over a decade old medical rollout here in Rhode Island. So let's be honest about it. Cannabis is here, and it's part of a wellness revolution, if you will, that's moving forward. I guess let's talk about that right out of the gate. What does that entail? When we think about cannabis in the context of wellness, what comes to mind for you?
I could start with that one. Cannabis is obviously it's a mind-altering substance, but it's also loaded with molecules and compounds that are anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. There's a way to consume it where our lives we're surrounded by inflammation. Where inflammation is a big part of us. It's in the food. The food that we eat causes inflammation in our bodies, and so in constant exposure to the environment is causing inflammation all the time. There are compounds in cannabis that can help calm that down. So when you talk about a health and wellness revolution, not only are we talking about ways for the mind to sort of relax and relieve stress, we're also talking about ways that the body can use some of these compounds to recover.
I think that's part of it, right? If you look at cannabis as a plant, if you have an ethnobotanist who really looks at the compounds that are found in a plant, you've got 1,000 medicines in there that can be used for various maladies. Some of those are going to be mind-altering. THC can certainly be compared to alcohol in many ways, but there are many other cannabinoids that have no psychoactive capabilities in the body and offer really some interesting anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, anti-epileptic mechanisms that can promote health, that can treat disease, that can do all sorts of things. And what's interesting is this is sort of the wild, wild west when you're looking at these compounds in the plant, because many of them have barely been studied. The studies that are out there have operated with very little funding, and we're just starting to see now that there really are some major benefits when you start to break down cannabis and look at the various compounds, especially the cannabinoids. What can they do to human physiology? So there's a lot of things out there that we're going to learn in the next 10 years about the wellness approach or the recreational relaxation approach. How does it fit into society as a recreational drug, just like alcohol, or as a medicine that's purified and compounded and dosed out appropriately for real conditions.
One thing that's interesting is when it comes to cannabis and I guess you would say the sell towards moving towards legalization here in Rhode Island. We would hear about a number of things such as economic development opportunities, small business opportunities, interaction with police departments that are able to say, hey, look, we're not enforcing this maybe anyway, or we don't want to be enforcing this other than obviously operating a motor vehicle or something of that sort. But rarely do we hear political leaders talk about what you guys just described, the wellness component of this. Why do you think that is?
I think there's still a stigma here. I mean, if you look at, look back on our history, there was quite a bit of actual research going on with psychedelic type medications up until about, the late 60s, early 70s, when many of these things were banned and listed as Schedule I controlled substances. And, we've dealt with this topic in previous podcasts as to, the numerous factors, political factors that sort of went into, listing these substances as being, that top tier banned Schedule I category. But, we have some information here already. And that has been suppressed. And there has been a lot of messaging to the public that, the war on drugs is say no to everything. Anything that could potentially alter your mind is dangerous. Look, we're entering into a new era now where technology has brought us into this realm of being able to sort of control the dosing of these substances so that they are not sort of overwhelmingly on the intoxication scale like, to the far right. We can actually dial these things back a little bit and, reset or supplement or balance chemical processes that are going on in the brain to make us feel normal again. And, in a society that is riddled with, stress and demand and, everyone's got access to you 24/7 with modern technology. I mean, there are living conditions that are much more stressful now than they were even decades ago. So I think it's an opportune time where we look back at some of this science and we figure out where we really are. And we look at the opportunity to advance it to where we can be, and we actually give this thing a chance. Start looking at these substances in a way where they can be used constructively to make people's lives better.
You think back, I don't know, Bill, I'm not sure you're old enough, to the commercials. This is your brain, and this is your brain.
Oh, the scrambled
drugs.
eggs and all
Scrambled
that.
eggs,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So, I always think about this because that was sort of like the say no to drugs, don't touch marijuana, especially the marijuana being popular back then in the 1980s and me being a kid, and this was a stay away from this stuff sort of thing. Now I think back as a physician, or even over the past few years, we've got a drug called Epidiolex, which is purified CBD, which actually reduces the seizure potential in your brain. So we use this for epileptics, mostly for kids. And so it's actually, if this is your brain, this frying egg in the pan, put it back in the egg and put it back together. This is your brain on Epidiolex. So there really is so much of this sort of nasty stigma that's been sown about for decades, where if you really looked at the plant and looked at the compounds, if we had been paying attention and putting some money toward research, we would have realized earlier that there are actually a lot of useful compounds in that plant for disease states. And epilepsy is probably one of the better known ones at this point, but probably one of the most important ones.
If you have a question for the doctors, feel free to send me an email, bill@ripodcast.com, and we'll get to them over the course of the series. We heard from Sue in Northern Rhode Island, who's a medical provider herself and is concerned about lack of guidance when it comes to mixing cannabis with other prescribed medications. And that's something that from any sort of prescriber standpoint, there may not be explicit guidance on. What's your recommendation from both the provider side and from the patient side as to mixing cannabis with any number of other prescription meds?
I'll tell you, the first point for any physician out there is do not be prescriptive with cannabis. Do not prescribe in dosages at this point. There is no guidance. And so, what you can do is offer your medical advice and state it as such, and offer some insights into whatever research you've been able to read and and what you've been able to understand through your pursuit of knowledge, but do not be prescriptive about it. And the concern about interactions with other prescription medications is absolutely correct. We've got a metabolic pathway mostly in our liver, so for ingested cannabis products, there are these little enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, which are responsible for metabolizing certain medications. And they can be changed by ingestion of cannabis. And so let's take a simple example. A proton pump inhibitor that you can buy at the CVS down the street to help for your heartburn can actually increase the serum concentration of THC. And so, you can have a very different reaction to a orally dosed cannabis product if you're on certain prescription medications. And, to think otherwise is foolish. These are compounds that are metabolized in our body, and the other drugs that we've used mostly for medicinal purposes prescribed by a physician can certainly interact.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are very common medications. Omeprazole is one of them. People buy that over the counter for acid reflux. The point is, though, that there are drug-drug interactions. I mean, any compound or substance that you put in your body that is, sort of chemically active, for lack of a better term, is going to compete with receptors for, in competition with other drugs, and it can alter the effectiveness of those medications and or prolong or diminish the effects of cannabis.
It's also interesting to note that, those enzymes which are responsible for metabolizing majority of the compounds we use for medicines are also one of the main distinction points for human beings in how they will react. So you can take two subjects, give them the same dose of the same THC and CBD and CBN, whatever it might be, and they may have two very different reactions to it. And that is mostly owing to the fact that their enzymes are genetically different than yours. And so there's a lot of interesting sort of metabolic activity that can be understood in the future, will be understood in the future. But yes, drug-drug interactions and also just the genetic characteristics of the host are very important.
Yeah, so I would say one other thing, just on that topic. I mean, there is a lot of fear amongst medical providers in the community about getting involved in any sort of counseling or discussion with patients about cannabis. I will tell you that, you as a medical provider are protected in your ability to discuss these compounds, this substance openly with patients, to talk about potential drug-drug interactions. You can even make recommendations as far as what types of things to look for on a product label that might be more suitable for your symptoms. But the one thing you cannot do is you cannot basically write a prescription. I can't tell you what specific product to use at a specific dose, the way that we would write a prescription medication for any other pharmaceutical drug right now. And that's just because of this substance being listed as a Scheduled I controlled substance now. But as a medical provider, the U.S. District Courts have decided, they have ruled in favor of providers, because we are offering medicinal marijuana legally in states, that providers should be there. They should be allowed to use their expertise and their skill sets to help guide patients. So, it's tough because we are still uncovering lots of information, but there are plenty of resources out there for providers, some of which are, dedicated books or even like, paperbacks that are sort of like the summary, easy to read type for medical providers. Here's how you handle cannabis questions. Those are very important. And part of our mission, Jonathan and I, is to try to help educate providers to be more effective in that role. Just because, we do see providers as being this necessary bridge in getting people comfortable with the substance and using it in a way where it's beneficial and they're not sort of overshooting their therapeutic mark.
Yeah, and if you please,
I would just say to Sue, to allay her fears, Rhode Island has a medical marijuana program, and it's been around for over a decade, I believe. And if we have a medical marijuana program and we don't expect medical professionals to be able to discuss it, I mean, why do we have a medical program in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the, maybe this is a good time to sort of just clarify for listeners the way that medical marijuana program actually works. you do need to have one of a certain list of qualifying diagnoses to be eligible for a card. And these are all diagnoses that, this list wasn't just pulled out of thin air. I mean, I mentioned before that we have some research to base this on, and these are all diagnoses where, cannabis or the components in cannabis have shown to have a beneficial effect in the past, up until the 1970s, early 1970s, when this was kind of ripped out of the clutches of the research physicians saying, you can't touch this stuff and research it anymore. So if you do have one of those qualifying diagnoses, you would be eligible for a medical marijuana card. So you have a physician sign off on paperwork, basically testifying to the fact that you have this diagnosis, and then you register as a patient with the state. There may or may not still be a small fee associated with that registration, but once you get that card, it's basically your entry key to get into a retail facility right now. But when you walk in, there isn't necessarily a lot of professional guidance available.
There's no doctor there.
There's no doctor. There's no pharmacist on site. I mean, there are people that have had lots of experience with cannabis that may be able to be effective in guiding some people, but there's nobody there with the sort of medical training to say, hey, well, here's one thing you should look out for if you're on this medication, or even screening patients by saying, hey, do you take this medication? If so, you may want to stay away from this really high potency stuff, because this is going to stick around a lot longer, than it would if you were, not on this
and even
proton pump inhibitor.
Even simple advice like that, which comes from, it's simple for us, but it comes from a depth of decades of learning in medicine for us. But that's the sort of information that will help people not have a terrible experience the first time they walk in and out.
Right. And I guess that is one of the major issues right now, is that the medical marijuana programs, I'm glad they're there, but there's a lot of room to go in getting them sort of fine-tuned and being more effective for the patients that rely on them. And that's just, the guidance factor behind when they walk in that door. How do they choose the right product for the symptoms that they're looking to treat? And again, now we're entering into this wave of sort of recreational legalization, which, again, I believe everything is on a spectrum here, and a lot of people self-medicate. So even if you're considered a recreational user, you're sort of using it for a particular purpose, maybe to help you relax after a stressful day, or help you fall asleep or stay asleep. There are a number of things that you can use cannabis for, in sort of a self-medication sort of way. So I put all of these indications for use on a spectrum, and I feel that level of guidance is necessary no matter who you are as a consumer. So,
yeah, that's all significantly great advice. And if you have any questions, again, Bill at ripodcast.com. We'll get to them each and every episode. This is Inside Cannabis, presented by PureVita Labs here on the Bartholomew Town podcast. And, one thing that we hear a lot, anecdotally, specifically, is how do you identify bad or contaminated cannabis? We've talked about this extensively in the series. In fact, it's one of the fundamental tenets of your business is being able to lab test and identify and effectively label cannabis. But let's say you're somebody, cannabis is now legalized, you're listening to this down the line, it's December, and you go into a store and you're wondering, how do I identify what's good and what's bad cannabis? Where do you start?
You got to take it home and put it in your high-pressure liquid chromatograph and run it at 378 degrees Celsius through a tube. No, there are labels on these things now, right? So you have to have some faith in the system right now that the products on those shelves are safe for consumption, first of all, that even if you do accidentally, take this thing at too high of a dose, or you didn't realize that you had a medication interaction brewing, waiting for you, that you're still going to be okay and hopefully not wind up in an emergency room. So the laboratory testing is huge. It's absolutely important, and it's so necessary for it to be a third-party, independent, academically focused sort of just accuracy is at the core of everything we do to make sure that those products are safe. But when you're looking at products, visual inspection is important, right? Does it look moldy? I'd stay away from it if it does. And, we've had some issues with some edible products around the States over the years where powdery mildew was actually still, growing. You put it in your drawer for a week and you take it out and it doesn't look the same. That goes for flour as well. So visual inspection, if it looks odd, just like a slice of bread, if it's got a piece of mold on it, probably don't eat it. Odors, of course, and we can talk about the aromas versus odors of cannabis products. But if something doesn't smell right, if it smells foul or putrid, it's probably not good to consume it. Other ways to identify
good or bad
cannabis?
I'm going to start with making a point here just for clarification. I mean, if you are an otherwise, healthy individual with a strong immune system, there are certain levels of, mold spores or biological pathogens that could be present in cannabis that aren't really ever going to harm you. But when we're dealing with medicinal cannabis, there are a lot of patients that are on chemotherapy that are they're immunocompromised. They've got terminal illnesses or chronic illnesses that make them more susceptible to infections. So, as labs, we want to be sure that these products that are being put out there aren't going to harm those patients, let alone, anyone else that would consume them. So we have to be very stringent on where these marks are, where we set a pass-fail for whether or not a product is safe for retail. That being said, yes, as John said, visible mold on a product is clearly a problem. But I would also look at, when the product was tested, which is, that's on the label now. And a lot of times you'll see, hey, a product was tested 6 months before I'm buying it at retail. If that's the case, if time has elapsed, then you take a look at, if you're talking about cannabis flower, you take a look at the flower. You should see a lot of green and a lot of sort of, vibrant color in the flower itself. As it starts to age, the potency will decrease. The active ingredients in there will decrease over time, particularly if it's not stored properly. And so that cannabis will then kind of take on more of a sort of yellowish or brownish type tone. And, this is looking at people that are good at this have seen lots of cannabis. There are connoisseurs out there that can say, this looks like aged cannabis. They can look real close at these trichomes, these little sort of oil blisters that are on the flower that hold all the active ingredients and say, they look like they're kind of smushed up and crushed. And I don't expect this flower to be as effective as something that's really fresh. But, above all, it's important, as John said, to just, realize that labs are there for the entire industry. They're not only there for the consumer, but they're there to make sure that products are trusted and safe and that brands actually have credibility in the eyes of the consumer. So, when we got into this business, the purpose was really, it was twofold. Well, it was threefold, but from a safety standpoint and from a sort of dosage standpoint, we wanted to make sure that accuracy was paramount. And there is a lot of, fraudulent behavior going on in the lab market, and we've seen that in multiple states across the country. But, making sure that these products are actually free from contaminants, at levels that would be safe for even an immunocompromised patient to ingest. That is one thing, but also making sure that what we put on that label for potency is accurate for the consumer. And we've used this analogy before. People that sort of start ingesting alcohol for the first time, it takes a couple times to start to realize how many drinks you can have before you're going to get sick or be over intoxicated. That's, working on the premise that what percent alcohol by volume is in each one of those drinks that you're consuming. It's written right on that beer can. If you can imagine now a product where the label is inaccurate and it says, this is 21% THC, but who knows? It could be 17. It could be 15. If you're using products and you're trying to gauge how much you take and you want to be able to go back to that regimen and use it consistently and get the same experience, if the labels are inaccurate, it's a total crapshoot.
Yeah, and that's a great point, actually. So if you went to the liquor store, and I know I listen to people who are out on the boat and like, what percent alcohol is that? Nah, no, too high for me. And so people have really started to pay attention to this stuff, and they understand what's too high of a alcohol percentage for them. If it's 14%, sure, I can have a little bit. It's like wine. If it's 2%, it must be Corona Premier. You can have 3 or 4 of them. So you do have to be able to rely on the veracity of that label. But I want to go back to a point you made, which I found really interesting, about not all biologic organisms growing on a plant may be pathologic or dangerous, and this is the case. And so a good example of this and why laboratory testing is important in your everyday life. You can go to the grocery store and it's on you to flip over the strawberries and make sure you're not getting moldy strawberries, right? But there's nobody. They're not They're not putting crime scene tape over it when they find some mold on there.
Right.
However, the salmonella that you can't see, you can go through every iceberg piece of lettuce and be like, "Is salmonella on this?" You can't see it, right? It may be there, and you have to rely on the regulatory standards of the food supply to catch that salmonella contamination, because that's the one that's going to make you sick. Also, you mentioned, the color of things, and you think about this. You buy a bunch of spinach at the store. How long does it last until it's wilted and brown? Do you eat it when it's wilted and brown? No, you don't. You throw it away. And so if you get a piece of cannabis that looks brown and yellow, and this thing's been hanging around a little longer. Now, most cannabis has been dried, so the moisture content is gone. So it does take longer to decompose, but it's plant material. It rots. It rots like any other plant material. And you don't want to eat or smoke anything rotten. So you do have to pay attention to that visual inspection. But I thought those were two pretty good observations on your part.
Yeah, I guess kind of to that point as well, for consumers who are purchase flower, or really anything, what's the best way to maintain that freshness, if you will? Is there a storage? I don't know if you'd call it a device, but also just best practices for storing cannabis and keeping it fresh.
Yeah, I mean, this is it can lead into sort of a loaded discussion here, but I'll tell you, to
Vegetable
simplify,
crisper.
right off the bat, to simplify, you want to store it in a cool and sort of dark place. I mean, heat and light can degrade the active compounds in cannabis over time. That being said, it is best to try to store this stuff in an airtight container. So a lot of people use, like a jam jar, or even, look, I would say one of the best ways to do it is to use one of those containers where you can sort of vacuum seal it, But, again, these compounds that are in there, they do aromatize, they volatilize, they vaporize. And as cannabis sits, particularly if you're exposing it to light and heat, that active ingredient in there will actually go from flower into vapor form. And if you don't have an airtight container, you're just sort of spilling out those ingredients into the environment. So a lot of people will, really what you should do is store your cannabis in a place where it's less than 65 degrees, but usually an airtight container, and keep it in an area that's not well lit, dark. And one other point, these are adult substances. And we do hear stories about kids that accidentally ingest edibles, gummies, because they think it's candy, and they'll show up in an emergency room. And, look, I mean, the good news is the vast majority of these kids, within 24 hours, they're released from that care because the effects are self-limited. But it can be very scary for a kid. It can be traumatizing. You need to store these products in a safe way. You need to protect kids from these products. These are adult substances. Yep. I think that they're fine for adults in a controlled fashion, but I don't advocate for anyone under the age of 21 regularly using cannabis. And there are reasons for that medically, which, I don't know if we want to get into them now. But so again, that is the point, is make sure you're keeping these things in, if you have gummies, keep them in a little locked safe box or something if you have small kids.
That is the most
the packaging is childproof, but it's not fail-safe. And look, I mean, my kids, they know how to use scissors. I mean, This is a different scenario, because I do talk openly with my kids now about cannabis, because I believe that this is going to be integrated into society just like alcohol. And I explain to them, I say, these are adult substances. You can't have these until you're 21. They're sort of medicines for some people. They help a lot of adults relax. And, we get into talks about stress and work and all that stuff. And a lot of it goes over their heads, but they do understand, look, this is not something for kids. So I think it's very important now, as we start to shift gears in society, that we do sort of integrate teaching about this, and we store these products in a safe way where we're not exposing our kids. I mean, that's on us to make sure that our kids are safe. And it always has been in everything. I mean, remember the Mr. Yuck stickers when you were going, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, we want to advise kids, look, you stay away from this stuff. Yeah. It's not for you.
This is triple X on this, right? Poison, poison, poison. But yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, the answer is the best way to keep your cannabis is away from children. But airtight containers in dark places, especially long-term storage, if you've got something that you want to save for a while and use maybe months from now, put it in the freezer. Airtight container in the freezer is perfectly fine. Deep freezer, the better. The faster it actually gets to that freeze point, the less likely you're going to have some some little ice particles break through and break down your cannabis. But keeping it cool, keeping it dry. I think the cigar connoisseurs out there will be just fine with their humidors for stuff that's going to be around for like maybe a couple weeks or a month. But if you're talking about long-term storage, anything longer than that, you want to really keep oxygen away from it and light away from it.
Yeah. All really interesting stuff. This is Inside Cannabis here on the Bartholomew Town Podcast, presented by PureVita Labs. Visit purevitalabs.com. Gentlemen, always a pleasure. Look forward to doing it again.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.